case of the sad case of Clarence Cooper, he, like going, stayed on the needle, or fell back into drugs. So they wrote from a certain reality, from a certain experience that they themselves had, and from the experience of some friends that they knew.
And they didn't pretty it up. Like Zora Neale Hurston used to get in trouble.
That's right. That's right. For her, right? Exactly. So that's all. That's right. So that's also been that interesting, which has come up again now around what is called ghetto lit, which is to say around Zora Neale Hurston's time, around the Renaissance, there was a struggle about the new Negro, right? Which was that the classic that was actually an anthology. There was Alan Locke had an essay in there. And they talked about, and that was a struggle between Locke and Du Bois about what should black literature should uplift the race,
right?
Should not betray the depths, should not betray the underworld, should betray the best, should betray the strivers, and obviously there's a reason for that. There's a reaction to this virulent racism in America, and so that was always this kind of interesting struggle, which even now, which like I said, gets played out. Certainly even today, although it's petered off somewhat, only because I guess ghetto lit itself has sort of run its course, because it partly is just repetitious. It's not particularly, a lot of it's not really well written. But ghetto lit, as it comes on the scene, particularly in the mid-90s until maybe, I guess, 2006 or something like that, again was this reflection of work, because it really kind of comes out of gangster rap. But again, it's a reflection of an audience that's hungry for something that isn't being met. They're hungry for some kind of stuff on the page that they're not getting. They're not getting from Richard Wright. They're not getting from Zora Neale Hurston. They're not getting from James Baldwin. And they're not reading them. And for better or for worse, they gravitate to this other material. And at least to some extent, I think for some folks, at least if they gravitate to that material, I think they go on to read something different. So in a certain way, I mean, it's not revolutionary, but it is interesting to note that there's always been that kind of discourse or conflict within the publishing realm, right? In terms of white publishing being white, in terms of, and I know this for a fact. When I came on the scene, several editors, they didn't say it to my face, but I know they would say, well, we've already got one black mystery writer, we don't need two, right? Because they're all the same, right? They're just, you know what I mean? So not differentiating any black writer from any other black writer, at least in the mystery genre. You know, we have our black mystery writers, so we fill that niche, you know, and so we'll move on. So, you know, so there's always that kind of interesting struggle, you know, that takes place.
Yeah, well, I mean, this isn't a panel about. It's funny, I did an article for Wiscon's a science fiction convention. They had a booklet. They were, one of the things they wanted to talk about was race and science fiction. And as one of the oldest white guy there, they asked me to write the article. And, but I mean, this isn't a panel about race and literature, but in a sense that you can't have anything about American literature that's not to some extent about race. And one of the things you said, you know, like for a white writer, you never run into that problem. They never say, you can't write about these lowlifes because you're going to make us all look bad. You know, so we don't have to worry about that. So there's an added dimension that comes in, that comes into black literature in a certain way. And I wonder how that, well, I don't know, how does that play out in, I mean, because now, well, I mean, I'm just saying, there's also, one of the problems in genre literature is that it always achieves, to some extent, respectability. So, you know, you have your Ursula Gwynn, even Philip K. Dick is respectable right now, you know. And what is, and I'm thinking in black literature, you know, now you have a, well, I don't know, you always had a certain, ever since Baldwin, I guess, there's been a certain level of respectability. So, I guess I was going to say, does that mess things up or not?
I've been thinking about, while we've been talking, I've been thinking about how there's a combination of noir and science fiction, which was called cyberpunk, and how much I disliked it. I like noir, where you have a vision of the world as it is, or as it was in the immediate post-war period, because because I think that that was where it was born, and that was where it spoke most fully, was in crime and noir of the immediate post-war period. And it was talking about the feeling of things closing off, that with the World War done, that the idea that anything could change, which certainly in the 30s, there was this notion that things were so unstable that in 15 or 20 years, everything could be changed, and it could be changed for the better or the worse, but they were in a super unstable period. And then in the post-war period, with the Allies having won and the world beginning to lock down into the current situation, there was this feeling that there was no way out, so that noir was about that. And then if that gets projected into the future, as it did in the 80s, with cyberpunk becoming noir, but saying 20 years from now, 30 years from now, it's going to be like 1948 in New York. And I was just violently opposed to that. I had almost an allergic reaction to that, saying, this is a misuse of science fiction. Science fiction is about change. It's not about us getting stuck and things being impossible. And that's, you know, Orwell already did that in 1984. The dystopia already had a really strong tradition going of its own, that things could get worse. But maybe things getting worse, okay, that's dynamic, we can't go that way. Things getting better, okay, that's progress. But things staying the same was almost, it was too depressing to, and also it seemed unrealistic. You know, things are going to change one way or another. They aren't going to stay, we're not in 1948 now, and we weren't in the 1980s. It was a kind of a artificial conceit of two genres being shoved together in ways that made the least of both of them. So I flew out of that situation in the 80s thinking, whatever else I am, I'm a science fiction writer who is opposed to what cyberpunk is saying about the current moment. It was a kind of a Thatcherite statement. There is no alternative. It was Fukuyama, the end of history. Things will never change. I was thinking, no. That has to be opposed. That has to be fought. So there's some times when genres can come together in ways that are not good.
Yeah, I agree. I had the same feeling as cyberpunk, that it was sort of science fiction without a utopian vision, and it was dystopian. But it's like you say, it was basically just. I felt that a lot of cyberpunk, even with Gibson, and I love Gibson's writing. I think right now he's sort of found his niche. But I felt like a lot of Gibson stuff was a hatred and fear of cities. It was sort of like. If you read Stephen King, I think the subtext of Stephen King is basically cities are bad, you know, and I felt like that was what that was about. And I don't know the politics of that, but yeah. But now in the you wrote to me just before we open this up to one of the most ambitious I felt sort of extrapolations of nation building in the Mars books, where you actually explore anarchism and socialism as ways, as actual means of social organization over a long period of time in a hostile environment. I mean, how did you go, when you were doing that, how were you thinking of that? What were the politics you brought to it?
Well, they were pretty lame. I was an English major, and I had been at the tail end of the Vietnam War, you know, with the draft number and everything. So I was sort of just a follower of the hippie moment in the early 70s, and there wasn't a whole lot of thinking going on. I was just part of a crowd. I never.
You thought of that on the page.
Well, but this is years later. But coming from that, I was thinking, well, Mars is a new opportunity, and it's going to be necessary to. This was, I think, my contribution, was the idea that science itself was a leftist utopian politics that had already been bought and had a gun to its head. That capitalism had, from the very get-go, that capitalism and science had begun together, and that they were like Siamese or conjoined twins, that had never separated out, and they were fighting for control of all of human history, and one of them was utopian, and I have just nailed my flag to the mast, as they were saying in Australia last month. Nailed my flag to the mast of is science being a force for good and essentially a leftist utopian political movement that wasn't aware of itself as such. And that it had always been bought and under the gun of the capitalist big system that we've lived in for so many centuries now. And that when you got to Mars, it was like Antarctica, where I'd actually been. That science was going to be the organizing principle and the only way of getting there in the first place. That it was actually a productive force, that it was a mode of production, and that, like Marx had called for, it was praxis. It was theory and action in the world mixed together into praxis. You could almost call it just technology. And so I began to play that game from the time that I was dissatisfied with Pacific Edge, and partly because of your commentary on it, from then on, with the idea that you can't just have utopia without a history to it, without a struggle to get there. And in trying to describe the struggle to get there in the Mars books, I decided that science ought to be re-comprehended. That it shouldn't be just be seen as the monkey grinding the organ for the organ grinder, which is capitalism. You know, the little guy that actually does everything, but is actually a somewhat oppressed counterforce that is always trying for good, and yet is bought and twisted and turned to inventing atomic bombs, etc., etc. But it's always been about medicine and about longer health for better human lives, and that it is the praxis that we've always been calling for from the left. So yes, that was the game I began to play in those books.
But you still believe that. You gave a talk on it, that science in its very nature is collective and communal rather than...
Well, and it has also always been about making human lives better, and maybe trying to... now it has to be about doing that over the long haul rather than immediately. It's seen its own hubris. It's seen the mistakes that were made. It's trying to correct it all. I still am a sort of science patriot, and I realize that this is oversimplifying the big picture. It's sort of like playing with sock puppets, you know, like Hunch and Judy, bang, bang, bang. But that's where I will put the focus of my support, with the idea that the left has always just, as often, said science is just the lackey of capitalism, or the instrumental arm of capitalism. I'm saying, no, no, no. They've always had the gun to their head just like everybody else, and so let's support them and see if we can start a revolution from within. And so that was what the Mars books were all about, and I've come back to that repeatedly in the books I've done since with it. As I say, it's been a vexing, you know, aesthetically this program has been confusing at best. But well, this is what I've been struggling towards.
All right. But then if science is like the hero in that way, it seems like I was reading the Underbelly, and in a lot of your work, it seems like you also have this overarching system, but it's, in many ways, it's the legal criminal system. The legal system, which is basically the criminal system, you know, it's all put together. And that seems to be the system in which everything operates. So you have the individual that's either the cops are after him or they ought to be. So how does that work?
Well, I think in particular well, I'll just say from my point. So writing essentially mostly black characters operating in some form of the criminal justice system, which is part of the prison industrial complex, though they don't talk about that. But they're aware of it. And so they have at best, I think I've written one book. Yeah, I've written one book about cops, and even then they were, you know, dirty cops.
Imagine that.
Imagine that. And in fact, one of the editors who rejected that book was concerned that not only was all the 5 main characters not good and varying degrees